everyone, RogueGold here. Welcome back to the Division 2. And today, I've got another dev stream recap for you. That's right, yesterday we got some surprise news that a dev stream was incoming. This is a bit of a new format because overall, this was really just a live reading of the dev notes that were released today after the second PTS phase for the incoming Year 8 Season 2. On screen, you're seeing Yannick, the game's creative director, and Alex, the game director. They hopped on to just basically have an informal live chat about some of the changes made after the PTS phases, what the findings were, and how they're viewing all of these things heading into the next season of the game. So there are full published dev notes that are now online. I will leave a link for those down in the description below in case you want to go and read through them instead of hearing me yap at you. But I thought it was quite interesting to get their insights as they went over topics like escalation, prototype gear, the PvE Dark Zone. There's a lot of stuff in here and some things that I think at least a good number of you should be pleased to see. So let's just get right into the recap. They began with the usual introductions as well as a brief chat just about the nature of the public test server for this coming season. They acknowledged that PTSs in recent times have come very late in the process, and so that leaves them not much room for feedback implementation prior to launch. They noted that this is the first season and public test server that they've been able to do 2 phases for in quite some time, and alongside that, the first phase came earlier than they would normally share these builds, and so that meant that they had the time and flexibility to go in and make at least somewhat substantial changes. They also noted that whether it's for this one or seasons in the future, if you ever notice that between phase 1 and 2 of a PTS that there are sometimes drastic or contradictory changes between the two, they say at times that can be intended. They're testing an A, they're testing a B, and then at the end of both, they can compare and see where they want things to land. But let's get into the main topics here, beginning with escalation. They started off by recapping some of the changes that are incoming to escalation tokens when it comes to the cost for entering each escalation tier, the payouts that you're now going to get as a group leader compared to a group member, and just talking holistically about the mode. They did talk about how they know that there are issues with disconnects and how you lose your tokens because of that, issues with how rogues continue to spawn within escalation missions. But then they dropped one of the first big pieces of information here. They talked about how their initial intention with increasing the costs at the prototype vendor was to balance out the economy inflation that they anticipate to see once this season goes live, right? Less cost of entry, less punishment if you die. That means more people are going to have more tokens, but they said they know things are not in a perfect place otherwise. They also saw the pushback that this change got when they proposed increasing the cost to prototype caches at the vendor. So because of all of that, this is the first of many things that we'll cover in this video that has been reverted. As of Year 8 Season 2, prototype caches are going to cost the exact same as they do now in the live game, which is 5 for the random caches and 10 for the specified ones, but they are also not changing what is happening to tokens or the fact that prototype items will now once again drop from crates within escalation missions. So overall, the trend should be more prototype drops, more that you can buy, and more tokens to go around. They then talked a good bit about mutators in escalation, saying that initially I think they had 4 new ones planned for Year 8 Season 2. A lot of those did not get very positive feedback on the PTS, however, and so the one that they are still going to bring to Season 2 has also been modified. The new mutator is called Variety Pack. It begins showing up at Tier 5 within the escalation ladder, and this is the updated description compared to what you may have seen on the PTS, but every 3rd enemy that you kill or assist in killing with your primary weapon will score you a damage debuff. However, when you swap to your secondary and you get a kill or assist with that weapon, it then cleanses that debuff and you restart the cycle. This new mutator is going to completely replace Anchor within the current rotation. That is the one that gives specific enemies huge damage shields, and I believe it also gives them incendiary ammo. That one is now completely gone. Variety Pack is the one taking its place. On top of that, they have made changes to 2 existing mutators, which they say is the beginning of an attempt to increase build variety within escalation. They acknowledge that it is very DPS centric right now. So for unyielding, which is the one that currently makes it so that low health enemies within escalation are completely immune to status effects, what that will now do is that when you reach that low health damage threshold, it will cleanse enemies of any current statuses on them. However, after that one-time cleanse happens, you can then go and freely reapply more statuses. And then additionally, the Harvester mutator, which allows enemies to regenerate their health and armor based on how much armor you're running. If you damage an enemy with that mutator with either a grenade or a status effect, it will completely remove it from them. them. So those two changes are not the end-all be-all to fix build variety within Escalation, but I think it's a decent start, and I hope they continue to do more things like this, because yes, the meta definitely needs to be shaken up in there. Next, let's then talk about prototype gear, and they begin this with a pretty candid explanation of where they think prototype gear is at compared to where they wanted it to be at when they launched it. They said that when they set out, prototype gear was meant to be a very rare and exciting drop. It was something that they envisioned being completely tailored for the endgame veteran player, but they said that the execution of it and the release of it did not align with that ideal. Everybody wanted to get the shiny new thing, and so they said overall, and this is something that they still think will play out in the coming months and updates, they are embracing that shift. They want to move towards greater accessibility for prototype gear. They said that this is factoring into the delay time that we are seeing of prototype recalibration launching, as maybe they had one plan for it back when it was intended to still be this very rare thing, but if it's now going to be a more core part of the game, then they want their system that they propose for recalibration to adapt to that. They also did very specifically note that they're not confirming whether or not optimization will come for prototype gear, but at least for now it is on the table. And they said that regardless of what they do, they want to be careful so that in 6 months, a year's time, we're not back in the same place where everybody has everything and there's nothing to truly go for in the end game, which I very much appreciated hearing. That has been my biggest concern with prototype becoming more available. I didn't want us to just end back up in a place where there was truly nothing to go for, and that's where the game was at for the past many years, and I think that detracted significantly from the longevity that it had with players. From a philosophical standpoint, that is where they're at. I'm very curious to see how that develops in the coming months. But there are two key changes being made to prototype gear and the prototype economy with Season 2. For one, they are reverting the proposed augment upgrade costs that were present on the most recent PTS phase. The dev notes mentioned that this will likely be slightly adjusted compared to what you see on the live game now, in that they want upgrade costs to be cheaper on the initial levels, but then more expensive on the later ones. But the total amount of cores that it costs for you to upgrade an augment to maximum level should remain the same as it is in the live game. The important part is that the total upgrade cost, which was going from I believe 31 to 46 on PTS Phase 2, that has been completely reverted and is not happening. And then, this one is probably one of the biggest changes that they announced here. Prototype augment re-rolling is now going to cap out at 6 prototype cores. So in the live game now, every time that you re-roll, it gets progressively more expensive up to a cap of 25. I think it's 2, 4, 6, 10, 16, and 25 is the curve. That curve now stops at 6, right? So your first re-roll is 2, then 4, then 6, and it stays there. That is obviously a very drastic reduction compared to 25. Given the RNG involved with re-rolling in this way, I think this is a beneficial change, and hopefully that helps settles a lot of the frustration that I think people have very understandably run into in that specific area. Okay, moving on to the PvE Dark Zone and just the Dark Zones in general. A good amount of things happening here, a good amount that I'm excited for. So first off, they clarified that the stabilization agent, which was one of the most controversial additions to PTS Phase 2, they're not going to be removing it from the new season. They view that as one of the risk factors of the PvE DZ in the absence of PvP. They also said that they want the PvE DZ to play differently than the rest of the game. They want it to be a shared space. They want to encourage people to seek one another out, and so they view the stabilization agent as one way for that to happen, but they acknowledge that the economy for them and the actual method of going to obtain them was not ideal in PTS Phase 2, as we highlighted in our own video. So there have been some very specific changes made in that regard. This includes the fact that now, when you open up a chest within the PvE Dark Zone, all nearby agents will now get loot to drop on the ground, regardless of whether or not you are actually grouped up with the person who opens it. This is a great change. They said this was a technical change they had to make behind the scenes compared to how chest loot works within the PvP Dark Zones, for example. So while the actual drop rate of stabilization agents are not being increased, again, this does further encourage you to run with other people in the PvE Dark Zone, because if one person opens a chest and there are 11 other people nearby, that is 12 total chances at a 33% drop rate for you to get a stabilization agent. But in addition, stabilization agents also now have a chance to drop drop from landmark bosses. They did not give a specific drop rate on this one, but I think in combination, again, both of those ideas do reinforce you seeking out and running with other people in the PvE Dark Zone, and I think that should help with the scarcity of this resource by quite a bit. Another change that they're making in regards to this is that extraction hunters now have an increased chance to drop Dark Zone keys to help with the chest economy, and so in total, I hope that all of those changes help the overall loop of the PvE Dark Zone, make things a little bit smoother, promotes that people seek one another out and play together. We'll see how it lands, but I think all of those things are beneficial. They then also dove into the topic of reward when it comes to the PvE Dark Zone versus the PvP one. This was something that I harped on pretty heavily in my Phase 2 feedback. I always think that the PvP Dark Zones have to remain more rewarding given that you're taking on the increased risk of PvP. So they're doing two specific changes here. For one, they're not going to remove the chance for exotic components to drop from PvE Dark Zone chests. And keep in mind, it should now be even easier to farm those given that everybody is going to get the loot from a chest when somebody opens it, so long as you're in the vicinity. But in the PvP Dark Zone specifically, the drop rate for exotic components is going up to 40% from DZ chests. This is now going to be one of the highest drop rates of exotic components within the entire game. Only second to this other change that they're making, where only in the PvP Dark Zones, exotic components can now drop from challenging and heroic landmark bosses. And those drop rates are going to be at 33% for challenging and 48% from heroic. I'm a big fan of this. I did not really want them to go in and nerf how lucrative the PvE Dark Zone could be. I think it's important that that is rewarding given it is the core activity of the season. But again, you can't invalidate the PvP Dark Zones in the process. So I think this is a pretty good middle ground. And between greater DZ currency, yield, and the fact that exotic components will now be dropping much more frequently, I'm eager to get in there and start farming the PvP Dark Zones. Finally, then on the topic of the DZs, and this applies to pretty much everything that we just went over, across all of the Dark Zones, PvE and PvP, they have decreased the global DZ chest cooldown time from 30 minutes to 20 minutes. And so while not a game changer, it will just mean that you will get loot slightly more frequently, and that should help out with all of the aforementioned points. They then moved on to talk about PvP. They said that there is going to be a full list of changes coming with the full season launch patch notes. It is far more than they could address here because they said that the lead PvP designer has been continuing to change a lot of things since PTS Phase 2, but there were 3 specific balancing changes that they did shout out. And again, to be explicitly clear, these things only apply when you're within the Dark Zones or conflict. Heartbreaker is getting its damage and armor per stack value reduced by 0.1%. Core Strength is getting its shared core attribute value increased by 5%. It was down to, I think, 10 and 20 if you use the chess piece in PTS Phase 2, so I assume that will now be 15 and 25. However, it now counts skill efficiency as a 10% value per skill tier instead of 15. So hopefully that means core strength as a set remains relevant, but it decreases some of the lethality that it was giving to skills. I suppose we'll find out in the full launch. This change specifically then I believe does apply to both PvE and PvP, but the Caduceus is being increased once again to now 3% healing, and that is up from the 2% that it was at on the PTS. They did confirm, which was great to hear, that the subsequent balance pass focusing on skills for PvP is aimed to be coming during Season 2 at some point. They just said that this one is requiring a bit further testing to ensure that the overrides they're doing here only apply to PvP and do not bleed into PvE. And then finally, on the topic of PvP, they did dive into anti-cheat a little bit. Mostly it's stuff that we've heard before, but they said that information given out about anti-cheat updates is always limited due to not wanting to give cheat makers more advanced or more in-depth info. They said that cheating is never truly fixable, but it can be made much better than it is, and they said that they are making big investments into this area compared to years past. Some of that, they said, will be launching alongside Year 8 Season 2, whereas more is going to roll out in the future, but overall they said they will monitor how these things go, and one thing that they are looking into are better ways to showcase and communicate banned cheaters to the community or people who report them, because they acknowledge that while they can say as much as they want, oh, we've banned this amount of people, or this is who we've banned, that doesn't always come across in a satisfying manner. Alright, and then finally there were a few quick miscellaneous points that were made. The question came up about crossplay, as it naturally does. They said, do not fear, as soon as there is news about it, they will share it. They understand the community's eagerness. Currently, they said the additional time they're taking is really to solve all of the potential edge cases that arrive with this feature. A few that they listed out are like leaderboards. They say, do we want to make them completely shared or platform exclusive? Or they said, do you go for kind of a hybrid method, which goes console to console, but then leaves PC on its own island? They talked about aim assist. They said, should they modify the formula for aim assist when PC players fight against console players? Also clans. They said when somebody joins a clan with crossplay enabled and then they disable it, what happens? So they said they're going to take the amount of time that it needs to make sure that this system is foolproof, but as soon as it's ready, it'll be out there. And then the last thing really was they said they're looking into server disconnections across the board and trying to prevent them better as much as possible. And they said that is not only for the sake of protecting your tokens on an escalation run, but also just in general, as they recognize that that is a very frustrating experience. All right, everybody, well, that was just about everything that was covered in today's dev stream. Once again, the written format of this information will be linked down in the description below, courtesy of the dev notes on the website. But yeah, as far as Yannick and Alex, they said that they're curious to hear feedback if people think this stream format is worth continuing in the future. I think that having these more informal chats where there's a little bit of breathing room just to talk through some of the philosophy behind the changes that they make is nice, so I hope we do see more of these. Bottom line though, that is a lot of the changes to expect heading into Year 8 Season 2. They said that while they're not at liberty to talk about the exact release date yet, next season is coming very soon, and there should be news on that soon from everything that we know, including the in-game calendar that should be this coming Tuesday the 16th. So, buckle up. I expect that there will be a lot more news coming our way very soon. But yeah, that's everything I've got for you today. Folks, I would love to hear your thoughts on everything that we covered here. What did you think about today's dev stream? Not only the format, of course, but the content that was covered. Do you think these changes from PTS Phase 2 are sufficient? Are they enough? What else do you think requires attention moving forward? Let me know your thoughts. As always, I'll be very curious to hear them. But that's all I've got for now. And until I see you next, RogueGold out. Oh! We just got a Ravenous! I might not be friendly. Let's go.
Coming to the Division 2.
Let's go!
And